Well, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor. And today we're doing our graphic novel spotlight. Basically, I'm going to be talking about comic books again. I know I just talked about comic books on Monday because I put out my read-along video for The Dark Knight Returns, because Steve Donahue and Mayberry Book Club are doing the fantastic read-along for Dark Knight Returns. So this will be the second time this week I'm talking about comic books. Today it's going to be something quite different. Today we're going to talk about Jack Kirby and some of Jack Kirby's greatest work. We're going to be talking about Jack Kirby's Monsterbus, because Jack Kirby did, before he did the Fantastic Four and all those great Marvel superheroes, he did a bunch of stories about monsters. Monsters were big back in the day. So I've actually got 2 volumes of this because it's a 2-volume set for Jack Kirby's Monsterbus. It's an excellent set. I love it. And we're going to talk a little bit about it and why it's so cool. Jack Kirby's old-timey monster stories. These were originally presented back in the olden days in comics like Tales to Astonish and Strange Tales and Journey into Mystery. Yes, Journey into Mystery, which I think that's the one Thor was in. I think it was Thor that was in Journey into Mystery. I could be wrong, but I think I think that was it. Thor was in Journey into Mystery, and I think Iron Man was in Tales of Suspense. I'm pretty sure. I'll have to look that one up because I get those confused as far as the early superhero stories are concerned. But yeah, Jack Kirby's monster stories, man. All these came out in those comics back before Marvel Comics was Marvel Comics. And those magazines, they were basically anthology magazines with a bunch of science fiction and horror type stories in it. The first time I encountered these, because these came out in the 60s, before even I was born, it was that long ago. The first time I encountered them were in some beat up old back copies of a magazine called Fear, which later became Adventure into Fear. And Fear was basically a comic that came out in 71, 72, 73. It was a quarterly comic, I believe. And it just was reprints of old stories that you would have had in Tales of Suspense and Journey into Mystery, back before they did superhero comics. And so just reprint stuff. But I had, I think, 7 issues of that. And then I picked up more of them. But I was kind of surprised that Marvel recently actually did an omnibus of that series, Adventure into Fear. So this is kind of a reprint of a reprint for a lot of it. So I was kind of surprised to see it. This actually collects the whole run of Adventure into Fear. And like I said, this starts off with reprint stories of old Jack Kirby monsters, like Zatak right there. Stan Lee came up with some pretty interesting character names, like Zatak. This is a Jack Kirby story right there. Just great old stuff. So that's how I first came across it, was through this reprint series. Eventually, Adventure into Fear stopped doing reprints and they started doing Man-Thing comics. And eventually they did The Adventures of Morbius, this vampire character right there. Morbius was the worst dressed vampire in history. More on him another time. But yeah, that was how I first was introduced to those stories. There was also another comic book that was pretty great called Creatures on the Loose that used to reprint those too. But I was pretty happy when these 2 volumes came out recently. I think it was maybe a couple years ago these came out. Big volumes, and these 2 volumes, the Monsterbuses, collect every Jack Kirby monster story. So for a long time, Stan Lee and his group of artists were doing a lot of science fiction and horror type of stories that were pretty innocent. If you could compare them to the stuff that came in the 1950s, they kind of had to be, because there was the Comic Code Authority at that time, which tried to suck as much fun out of comic books as possible. But eventually, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee came up with something that everybody loved, and that is giant monsters. In the 50s and the 60s, giant monsters were awesome. Everybody loved giant monsters. So every issue of of all these comics, became about different giant monsters, and you had a bunch of different giant monster stories. Now, in these early issues that are reprinted, they're just mostly science fiction stories that have monsters in them, but they're not the kind of monsters you'll see later. You'll see some of these great covers are reprinted in these volumes, the Monsterbuses. But eventually, you'll see even the Mummy becomes giant. That's Mum-X. Eventually, the giant monsters caught on. What was Gargantus? What was Gargantus anyway? Well, that was Gargantus. And every issue had like 4 different giant monster stories. They were all fantastic. Look at that guy. Look at that guy. Awesome. And there was so much imagination poured into these stories, and they were just great. We also have the introduction of Ant-Man in this particular story. He's not identified as Ant-Man. He's just the man in the anthill. But this man, he became Ant-Man, who ended up starring in a bunch of movies. Who would have thunk it? Yeah, just fantastic artwork. And through these monster stories, Stan Lee's storytelling was just fantastic. And Jack Kirby's his talent, it just got better and better and better as things went along. Just so much great stuff in these books. Here's the thing about Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby, and these books are worth it just because it has his stuff in them. Jack Kirby is the most important comic book creator who ever lived. There is no more important figure in comic books or graphic storytelling in general than Jack Kirby. I know there are a lot of people out there who don't get that, who can look at Jack Kirby's artwork and think it's crude or whatever and just don't understand why he was such a big deal. He was a big deal. He had a towering imagination. Marvel Comics would not exist as it does if not for Jack Kirby and his imagination. I don't mean to take anything away from Stan Lee, because we wouldn't have it without Stan Lee either. But Jack Kirby was pretty darn important. And one of the fascinating things about Jack Kirby is that he started in the golden age of comics. And he was drawing comic books all the way through the Bronze Age of comics. That's a long time. So the entire span of the Silver Age of comics, he was drawing comic books. And another interesting thing about him, as far as his artwork was concerned, the longer he worked, the better he got. His comic book art was better in the 60s than it was in the 50s and the 40s. And I would argue that a lot of his work in the 70s was better than his work in the 60s. I think he got better artistically as he went on. He was just an incredible talent. I can't imagine where comics would be without him. So these 2 volumes right here, aside from the sheer fun of the monsters in here, and we do have the Fing Fang Foom, one of the best monsters of all time, is in the 2nd volume of the Monsterbus. Just aside from the sheer fun of these collect so much artwork and so many stories that you will not find otherwise. It's hard to find a lot of these old stories. And these volumes have them all. They have every single science fiction monster story Jack Kirby did in these two Monsterbuses. They're monstrous, they're giant, but they're fantastic. And yeah, when I was a little kid reading those old issues of Fear, Jack Kirby was the king, man. I loved his stuff. And of course, right directly from this stuff, he went on to the Fantastic Four. And you can see a lot of that style in these books, especially in this second volume. God, look at that. Just look at it. Tell me you don't want to read these stories. You can really see the continuity and how he can step right from this to the Fantastic Four. And when you're reading those first issues of the Fantastic Four, you see so much of this stuff in there. There are monsters everywhere in the first issues of Fantastic Four. And it was just a great time for comic books. And yeah, Jack Kirby, man, he was the king. He was the king of comic books. So, Jack Kirby's Monsterbus. These are omnibus volumes produced by Marvel Comics. I have to give it to Marvel, man. They have a great reprint line, and they know how to reprint their stuff. Yeah, good job, Marvel, as far as reprinting old stuff is concerned, because they do a great job of it. And these Monsterbuses, man, they're amazing. So, my highest recommendation to this, if you're interested in comic books at all, if you're interested in the history of comic books, if you just like monsters and science fiction stuff, if you can, check out the Monsterbus. I think they're still available in some places. I don't know how hard they are to get nowadays, but I know you can still get them. So yeah, Jack Kirby's Monsterbus. This week's graphic novel spotlight. I will catch you next week when we have something very different. Okay, guys, thank you.